The ghost on Flight 407. Imagine stepping onto a plane, sitting down, and securing your seatbelt. Hours later, the plane lands, but according to every digital log, government database, and physical paper manifest, your seat was completely empty. You were never on board. And yet, something was. In the high-stakes, heavily monitored world of commercial aviation, absolute precision isn't just a standard, it is the law. Before an airliner retracts its landing gear and ascends into the upper atmosphere, every single variable is accounted for. The weight of the cargo in the belly, the exact gallons of jet fuel in the wings, and, above all, the human beings in the cabin. Modern security protocol dictates that a person cannot simply slip through the cracks. Between biometric scans, physical ticket checks, facial recognition, and mandatory headcounts performed by flight attendants before the cabin doors lock, a commercial flight is perhaps the most intensely audited environment on Earth. Which is precisely why the events of November 14 are so profoundly disturbing. It began as a routine overnight long-haul flight across the open ocean. Flight 407 was scheduled for a 7-hour stretch across a pitch-black stretch of water, carrying 212 registered passengers. The weather was calm, the cabin crew was experienced, and the flight departed exactly on time. For the first 3 hours, the journey was utterly uneventful. The cabin lights were dimmed to a soft blue, the low hum of the twin engines lulled most of the cabin to sleep, and the flight attendants began their standard mid-flight checks. Row 23, Seat B. An aisle seat, positioned midway down the aircraft. During the pre-flight boarding process, cabin crew members distinctly recalled the passenger in 23B. A quiet individual, dressed in dark clothing, sitting motionless, staring straight ahead at the seatback screen in front of them. Nothing about their appearance raised an immediate red flag, just another exhausted traveler attempting to endure an overnight journey. Around 2 a.m. local time, roughly halfway through the flight, a primary flight attendant walked down the darkened aisle to conduct a routine cabin walkthrough. As she passed row 23, she noticed something odd about the passenger in seat B. The individual was sitting perfectly rigid, leaning slightly forward. Their hands were resting flat on the tray table, completely still. The flight attendant leaned in slightly, offering a bottle of water. No response. She spoke louder, asking if the passenger was feeling all right. Again, absolute silence. Thinking the passenger might be experiencing a medical emergency, she gently reached out and tapped the individual on the shoulder. The moment her fingers touched the fabric of the jacket, a chill went through her. The material felt oddly heavy, almost damp, and under the surface, there was no resistance. It was as if the clothing was draped over nothing at all. Startled, she pulled back, her voice echoing down the silent cabin as she called for assistance. Another crew member rushed down the aisle with a flashlight. Together, they directed the beam of light directly onto row 23. Seat 23B was completely empty. The seatbelt was still securely buckled across the vacant cushion. The tray table was folded down, untouched. The impression of a body was still visibly pressed into the foam of the seat, slowly reshaping itself as if someone had just stepped away a split second prior. Puzzled, but assuming the passenger had simply slipped off to the lavatory while the attendant was looking away, the crew checked every restroom on the aircraft. Every door was unlocked and vacant. They swept the aisles, checked the galleys, and even verified the crew rest compartments. The passenger was nowhere on the plane. Confused and growing increasingly uneasy, the lead flight attendant accessed the digital passenger manifest on her tablet to check the identity of the person assigned to 23B. The screen read, "Unoccupied." According to the Central Airline database, seat 23B had never been sold. The gate check-in logs confirmed that no boarding pass had ever been scanned for that seat. The TSA security checkpoints at the departure airport showed zero records of anyone assigned to 23B passing through security. Officially, legally, mathematically, no one had ever boarded the plane in that seat. Yet, 3 flight attendants and 2 adjacent passengers had watched a figure sit in 23B for over 3 hours. Panic began to quietly set in among the crew. They requested the captain run a full system diagnostic on the aircraft's internal sensors. Modern airliners are equipped with weight and balance sensors beneath the floorboards, capable of detecting minute distribution shifts across the cabin. The captain opened the central telemetry log. 3 hours into the flight, at the exact moment the flight attendant had reached out to touch the passenger's shoulder, the aircraft's telemetry recorded a sudden, inexplicable drop in mass within the cabin. Precisely 160 pounds vanished instantaneously. Then, the captain decided to review the closed-circuit security footage captured by the camera mounted above the main aisle. He rewound the feed to the moment of takeoff. Watching the grainy digital timestamp tick backward in green numbers across the monitor. The low-resolution lens had a complete, unobstructed view of row 14. As the video played forward at double speed, showing the cabin illuminated by the dim ambient glow of the night flight, Captain Miller's knuckles turned white on the edge of the console. At 2:14 a.m., 30 minutes after departure from Reykjavik, seat 14B was indisputably empty. The blue fabric cushion sat bare under the overhead reading light. Then, at 2:41 a.m., without the aisle light flickering, without a single passenger moving from their seat, and without the overhead bin opening, seat 14B simply was occupied. There was no blur of motion, no distortion of light, no transitional frames. Between frame 8941 and frame 8942, a silhouette in a dark, structured coat was sitting perfectly still, upright, staring straight ahead at the seatback screen in front of them. The seatback screen wasn't even turned on. It was reflecting a face that the low-light camera couldn't quite resolve, a smooth, featureless curve of skin where features ought to be, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. First Officer Vance leaned in, his breath fogging slightly against the glass of the screen. "Captain, play that frame shift again. Step frame it." Miller tapped the keyboard. Frame 8941, empty seat. Frame 8942, the passenger is seated. But it was what happened in the surrounding environment that made the hairs on Miller's arms stand on end. In frame 8942, every single digital display in row 14, the seatback screens, the digital clock on the bulkhead, the flight attendant's handheld terminal resting on a nearby cart, displaced their RGB pixels by exactly 3 centimeters to the left. The aircraft's internal air pressure sensor recorded an instantaneous localized vacuum surrounding row 14, followed by a rush of cold, high-altitude air that shouldn't have been physically possible inside a pressurized cabin. "Look at the flight attendant," Vance whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the display. On the monitor, the senior flight attendant, Sarah, was moving down the aisle with her flashlight. She stopped beside row 14, sensing the drop in temperature. In the video, Sarah leaned down, her lips moving as she asked for the passenger's boarding pass. The passenger didn't turn their head. They didn't move a single muscle. They weren't breathing. The camera's thermal layer, mapped over the optical feed, showed no plume of exhaled warm air coming from the passenger's nose or mouth. The passenger was a solid block of absolute zero, registering at -40 degrees Celsius, the exact ambient temperature of the stratosphere outside the aluminum hull. Then came the moment of contact. Sarah extended her right hand, her thumb reaching out to tap the passenger's left shoulder. On the video feed, the second her skin made contact with the dark coat, the passenger didn't collapse or dissolve. Instead, the video feed inverted its colors for 3 consecutive frames. When the image stabilized, Sarah was stumbling backward into the opposite row, clutching her chest in shock, and seat 14B was vacant once more. Except for one detail. On the seat cushion of 14B, where the individual had been sitting a fraction of a second prior, lay a small, dark object. It hadn't been there when the flight took off, and it hadn't vanished with the passenger. Miller locked the cockpit door, engaged the autopilot, and grabbed the heavy aircraft inspection flashlight from beneath his seat. "Vance, take the controls. Stay on comms with Gander Air Traffic Control, but do not, I repeat, do not, report a security incident yet. Just give them standard position updates." "Where are you going?" Vance asked, his voice cracking slightly. To check row 14 myself. Stepping out of the flight deck into the main cabin was like stepping into a meat locker. The air in the aisle was unnaturally dense, smelling faintly of ozone and crushed pine needles, a sharp, cold smell that had no business inside a Boeing 777 at 35,000 feet over the North Atlantic. The cabin lights were killed to allow the passengers to sleep, leaving only the dim strip lights along the carpet floor. Most of the passengers in economy were dead to the world, buried under thin fleece blankets. Sarah sat 2 rows back from row 14, her hands shivering violently as she held a paper cup of water, staring blankly at the dark outline of seat 14B. The seat was empty now. Or at least, to the naked eye, it appeared empty. The midnight blue upholstery was smooth, save for a shallow, lingering indentation in the headrest that looked as though someone had been pressing their skull heavily against it for hours. On the lowered tray table sat a half-empty plastic cup of ginger ale. Condensation was still pooling around its base, the tiny bubbles surfacing and popping in rhythmic, quiet succession under the dim aisle lights. He was right there, Sarah whispered to herself, her voice swallowed instantly by the relentless, low drone of the twin engines outside. I spoke to him. He asked me what time we land. 10 minutes earlier, the chief flight attendant, a tall, meticulous man named Miller with a neatly trimmed beard and a brass name tag that caught the low light, had swept down the aisle with an airline tablet. He had cross-referenced the passenger manifest 3 separate times. Seat 14B had belonged to an elderly gentleman who had cancelled his booking at the gate in Boston due to a sudden illness. According to the airline's mainframes, 14B had remained unassigned when the cabin doors were sealed. The physical passenger count matched the manifest exactly. There were 184 passengers aboard Flight 409. Not 185. Yet Sarah clearly remembered the man's presence. She remembered his voice, flat, slow, and strangely devoid of pitch, like a recorded voice playing at 3/4 speed. She remembered the scratchy, dry texture of his dark woolen sleeve when his elbow had briefly brushed against hers during initial ascent. She remembered the way he had stared out the oval window into the infinite black abyss over the ocean, never blinking, never shifting his weight, never turning his head even when the cabin crew rolled the heavy aluminum service carts past his shoulder. Driven by a sudden, desperate urge to prove her own sanity, Sarah reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out her smartphone. Her hands were trembling so violently that the device nearly slipped from her grip onto the carpeted floor. Shortly after reaching cruising altitude, she had snapped a quick, wide-angle photo of the cabin interior, a mundane, slightly blurry snapshot meant to be part of a text message to her sister once they landed in London. She tapped open her photo gallery, found the image, and pinched the screen to zoom in on the left side of row 14. Her breath hitched, locking hard in her throat. In the photo, taken under the ambient amber glow of the overhead lights, seat 14B was not empty. A man sat there, dressed in the dark, charcoal suit jacket she remembered. But where his face and head should have been, the camera had captured only a smear of milky, distorted gray static, like wet oil paint dragged across a canvas with a heavy thumb. Except for one terrifying detail. In the middle of that smeared gray haze, 2 dark, perfectly spherical eyes were rotated fully to the side, looking backward past the headrest, staring with razor sharpness directly down the camera lens at Sarah. A sharp wave of ice flooded Sarah's chest, freezing the blood in her veins. She stared at the screen, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird. She blinked rapidly, praying it was just a lens flare, a digital artifact, or a shutter glitch caused by the dim lighting. But the longer she stared at the image, the more those twin dark pupils seemed to sharpen against the blurred gray background. "Miss?" Sarah gasped, flinching so hard that water sloshed over the rim of her paper cup and soaked her knuckles. Miller was crouching in the dark aisle right beside her seat, holding a narrow flashlight aimed toward the carpet. His face was drained of color, his professional composure cracking around the edges. "I'm sorry to startle you," Miller whispered, his voice trembling slightly. I needed to come back down here. I wanted to look at seat 14B again. Look at this, Sarah rasped, turning the glowing phone screen toward his face. Look at the seat. I took this an hour ago when we were still over Nova Scotia. Miller took the phone with reluctant fingers. As he zoomed in on the distorted figure sitting in 14B, the remaining color vanished from his lips. He stayed frozen in that crouch for several seconds, saying nothing. Around them, the atmosphere inside the cabin felt suddenly thick and heavy, the steady roar of the jet engine sounding strangely distant, as if wrapped in layers of thick cotton. That's just a sensor error, Miller murmured, though his voice lacked any real conviction. He handed the phone back, his fingers trembling against hers. Low-light smartphone cameras do strange things with shutter speed. It's not a camera error, Miller, Sarah whispered, leaning closer. Where did he go? Why did everyone forget he was sitting there? Miller swallowed hard, his throat making a dry, clicking sound. He lowered his flashlight until the beam hit the floor directly beneath seat 14B. That's why I came back, Miller said, his voice dropping to a barely audible breath. When I went back to the forward galley to file the cabin report, I pulled up the digital weight and balance telemetry on the purser screen. Every seat on this aircraft has an automated pressure sensor built into the cushion frame to track passenger load for emergencies. He looked up from the carpet, his eyes wide and terrified in the dark. The sensor is reading 182 pounds of pressure on 14B right now. It has been reading that exact weight for the last 3 hours. Sarah felt the hair on the back of her neck stand straight up. She turned her head slowly to look back at row 14. As they both stared into the dim space, a soft, wet sound echoed from the dark upholstery of seat 14B, the sound of heavy leather creaking under shifting weight. Then came the slow, unmistakable hiss of a deep, ragged breath being drawn in through a dry throat. Neither of them moved. The air inside the cabin suddenly felt thick, heavy with the metallic tang of old copper and the cold, damp stench of stagnant river water. Captain Vance's hand tightened around the plastic rim of the flashlight until his knuckles turned translucent white. Slowly, deliberately, he clicked the beam on and swept it toward row 14. Seat 14B was empty. Yet, as the bright cone of LED light washed over the worn fabric, the cushion depressed further, sinking 3 inches into its springs as if a heavy body had just settled deeper into the frame. The blue velvet upholstery rippled, darkening in a sprawling, circular stain that radiated outward from the center of the seat. It looked wet, glistening under the artificial glare, but when Vance took a hesitant step forward, no liquid dripped onto the floor carpet. The stain just grew, blooming like ink in clear water. Vance. Sarah whispered, her voice barely a breath. Look at the window. The double-paned plastic portal beside seat 14B was completely frosted over from the inside, thick crystals of jagged ice creeping across the frame despite the cabin temperature resting at a comfortable 70 degrees. Traced neatly into the frost, as if drawn by a single, agonizingly slow fingertip, was a long, vertical line crossed by 3 short horizontal hatches. A tally mark. Before Vance could speak, the cabin's intercom system crackled to life with a sharp, static pop that made them both jump. It wasn't the captain's handset near the galley, nor was it the flight attendant station at the aft. The overhead speakers buzzed with the low, rhythmical hum of an open line, accompanied by the distinct, frantic clicking of a manual typewriter, a sound that had no business existing on a modern Boeing 737. Click-clack. Click-clack. Ping. The carriage returned, and then a voice bled through the speakers. It wasn't loud, but it was layered, dozens of faint, overlapping whispers speaking the exact same words in a flat, monotone unison that echoed off the plastic overhead bins. Passenger entry verified. Seat 14 Bravo. Ticket status, unpaid. Penalty status, accrued. The cabin lights didn't flicker, they vanished entirely, plunging the narrow tube into absolute darkness. The emergency aisle floor strips glowed a sickly, pale green, casting long, unnatural shadows up the walls. Down at the far end of the plane, in the pitch-black abyss of the first-class curtain, a heavy, metallic thump echoed, followed by the slow clink-clink-clink of heavy iron chains dragging along the carpet toward them. Vance thrust the flashlight forward, its beam cutting through a sudden, unnatural fog that had begun rolling out from beneath the seats. "Who's up there?" he roared, his voice cracking with a fear he couldn't mask. "This is a restricted aircraft. Identify yourself." The dragging sound stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so absolute that Sarah could hear the rapid, erratic pounding of her own blood in her ears. Then, right beside her ear, so close she could feel the icy, dead draft against her cheek, a dry voice rasped from the empty space of seat 14B. "He didn't pay the toll, Sarah. None of you did." Sarah spun around, swinging her arm blindly through the cold air. Her fist caught nothing but empty space, yet the fabric of seat 14B violently snapped back into place as if whoever had been sitting there had just stood up at blinding speed. The floorboards beneath their feet groaned under an immense, localized weight that began moving down the aisle, stepping over the green emergency lights one by one, blocking out the faint glow with invisible boots. It was walking toward the cockpit. "Vance, the door!" Sarah screamed, grabbing the captain's arm and shoving him forward through the mist. "It's heading for the controls." They scrambled down the narrow passage, their boots slipping on a thin, greasy film that had inexplicably coated the runner carpet. Vance reached the reinforced cockpit door first, slamming his palm against the digital keypad to punch in the security code. The red LED blinked once, twice, and then let out a sharp, continuous error beep. The screen didn't read "access denied." In glowing green digits, the keypad read, "occupied." The steward's hand trembled as he ran his thumb down the printed paper for the fourth time. 64 seats, 64 souls. Every name accounted for, every passport number matched to a face currently sleeping, reading, or staring blankly into the pitch-black void outside the windows of Flight 409. Yet, there she sat in seat 14B. She wore a faded yellow trench coat, dry despite the violent thunderstorm thrashing the aircraft's hull. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, fingers unnaturally long, resting over a worn leather handbag that smelled faintly of river mud and ozone. When the chief purser approached, adjusting his posture to project authority, he leaned down to ask for her boarding pass. She didn't turn her head. She merely pointed a pale, thin finger toward the digital display above her head. The seat number blinks, but where the passenger information screen usually listed occupancy status, there was only static, a slow, swirling spiral of white noise. "Ma'am, I need you to speak to me," the purser whispered, his voice dropping into the forced calm taught in crisis training. "We have a full manifest, and according to our system, 14B was left empty at the gate in Vienna." The woman finally shifted. The movement was wrong, too smooth, lacking the natural micro-adjustments of human anatomy. Her neck rotated toward him with a faint, wet click. Her eyes were not closed, nor were they open in any conventional sense. Dark, glossy film covered her sockets, reflecting the cabin's dim blue mood lighting like twin pools of spilled ink. A sudden pocket of severe turbulence slammed into the plane. Oxygen masks dropped with a mechanical rattle from the ceiling compartments. Screams erupted from rows 12 and 15, but the passengers in 14A and 14C remained completely motionless, their heads tilted back, eyes wide, paralyzed in a deep, catatonic trance. They weren't breathing. Panic surged through the crew. The purser lunged for the wall-mounted interphone to call the cockpit, but as he lifted the receiver, the speaker didn't output the captain's voice. Instead, it emitted the sound of rushing water, muffled cabin chimes from an aircraft model retired decades ago, and a low, rhythmic weeping. The trench-coated figure stood up. The air pressure in the aisle plummeted instantly, frost blooming across the overhead bins in intricate, crystalline webs. She opened her leather handbag. Inside was not money or travel documents, but a swirling, miniature storm, a vortex of black ocean water and crushed metal. She reached in and pulled out a heavy, waterlogged metal tag, dropping it onto the purser's folding service cart. It clattered against the plastic tray. It was an engine serial plate, corroded, caked in deep-sea silt and stamped with the exact tail number of Flight 409. "We sank 3 hours ago," she whispered. Her voice wasn't audio, it was a physical vibration inside the crew's teeth, cold and suffocating. "I am the only one who remembered to stay behind." The cabin lights flickered out completely. For 3 agonizing seconds, the sound of roaring jet engines was replaced by the deafening, crushing silence of the abyssal ocean floor. When the emergency floor strips buzzed back to life with a sickly green glow, seat 14B was empty. The frost remained. The waterlogged tag remained. 10 minutes later, the aircraft auto-landed safely at its destination, rolling silently onto the rain-slicked tarmac under the watchful eyes of emergency crews who had lost radar contact with the flight hours prior. The doors opened, and 64 passengers walked off, blinking under the bright terminal lights, completely unaware of the gap in their memories. The plane was swept, shut down, and locked for the night. But as the janitorial crew boarded at 3 a.m., they found a single wet footprint in the aisle next to row 14, pointing toward the cockpit. If all 64 passengers on the manifest stepped off the plane alive, who was driving the flight path through the dark?